The wine glass shattered against the marble floor of the Hanwari Grand Ballroom, and for one suspended second, 300 of Seoul's most powerful people stopped breathing. Imani Brooks stood frozen in a borrowed black dress, the stem of the broken glass still cradled in her trembling fingers, red wine bleeding across white Italian marble like something out of a crime scene. Across from her, Derek Vance, the man she'd crossed an ocean to be with, the man whose ring she'd worn for 11 months, wiped a fleck of Cabernet from his $1,000 lapel and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a cruel one. "Come on," Derek said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, loud enough for the cameras. "Look at her. She's not even that pretty. I did her a favor bringing her here." The words landed like a slap. Imani felt the heat crawl up her neck, felt the eyes of strangers crawling over her brown skin, her natural curls, the dress that didn't quite fit because it wasn't hers. She had given this man 4 years. She had paid his rent in Atlanta when his consulting firm collapsed. She had wired him $18,000 to close the Seoul deal. And now she was standing in a sea of glittering strangers, humiliated, abandoned, 12,000 kilometers from home with a return ticket Derek had quietly canceled 3 days ago. Then a voice cut through the silence, low, precise, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised. "Then why?" the man said, stepping out of the crowd. "Can't I stop looking at her?" Every head turned, because everyone in that room knew exactly who Tae Young-seo was, and exactly what it meant when he chose to speak. But to understand how Imani ended up here, dripping wine and dignity onto a billionaire's floor, we need to go back. If you've ever poured everything into someone who treated your love like a line of credit, if you've ever been told you were too much and not enough in the same breath, this story is for you. Because this isn't really a story about a mafia boss, or a ballroom, or a beautiful dress that didn't belong to her. It's a story about a woman who spent 4 years shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's plans, and what happened the night she finally stopped. The question I want you to sit with is this: what is the difference between being loved and being used? And why do the kindest people so often confuse the two? If you've ever asked yourself that, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, because Imani's about to learn the answer the hard way, and I don't want you to miss a second of it. 6 years earlier, Imani Brooks had been the kind of woman people described as reliable, which, she would later realize, was a word people used when they wanted something from you and didn't want to feel guilty about it. She'd grown up in the Mechanicsville neighborhood of Atlanta, the oldest of 4, raised by a grandmother named Odessa, who cleaned office buildings downtown until her knees gave out. Imani learned early that love looked like sacrifice. You gave until it hurt, and then you gave a little more, and somewhere in that arithmetic you were supposed to find your worth. By 22, she was working as a textile designer, the kind with real talent. Her fabric patterns had a way of making color feel like music, but she always undercharged, always over-delivered, always apologized for taking up space. Then she met Derek at a gallery opening in Castleberry Hill. He was charming the way a salesman is charming, all warmth and forward momentum, and he made her feel chosen. That was the drug, not the flowers, not the dinners. The feeling of being picked by someone who could have anyone. What she didn't see at first was the slow tilt of the scale, how his dreams became their dreams, how his bad months became her responsibility. When his import business, something vague involving electronics and overseas partners, hit a rough patch, she covered the rent. When it hit another, she dipped into the savings she'd built for her own studio. She told herself it was an investment. Partners did that for each other. That was the lie she believed, the one she'd repeat in the dark when the numbers in her bank account kept shrinking and the warmth in his voice kept cooling. "You're my secret weapon," he'd say, kissing her forehead. "When this all comes together, baby, we're set for life." She designed a whole collection that year and never showed it to a single buyer. There wasn't time. Derek needed her to manage his books, drive him to meetings, smile at men who looked at her like furniture. She started saying no to her own clients. Her name slowly disappeared from the design world she'd worked a decade to enter. Friends stopped calling. Her sister Tasha stopped pretending to like him. "He's bleeding you dry, Mani," Tasha said one night over the phone, her voice tight. "And the scary part is, you can't even see it anymore. You think this is what love costs. It's not. It's just what he costs." Imani hung up angry, but she didn't sleep that night. Then came Seoul. Derek announced it like a coronation, a massive deal, a once-in-a-lifetime partnership with a Korean conglomerate, and he needed her there to make him look established. He needed $18,000 too, to show good faith to the investors. She wired it the next morning. She emptied the studio fund she'd rebuilt twice. She booked her own flight in economy while he flew business. She told herself this was the moment everything turned around. She told herself Seoul was where their real life would finally begin. She was right about that last part. She was just wrong about whose life it would be. The Hanwari Grand was the kind of hotel where the air itself felt expensive, filtered, cool, scented faintly of cedar and money. Imani arrived jet-lagged and small, dragging a single suitcase past a lobby full of people who didn't dress like they'd ever dragged anything. Derek had a meeting the second they landed, so she found herself alone in the hotel's tea lounge that first afternoon, nursing a coffee she'd hesitated to order because of the prize. That's where the man first saw her, though she didn't know it yet. She noticed him because he was the only person in the room not performing for anyone. He sat by the window with a single cup of black tea and a folded newspaper he wasn't reading, watching the city the way other people watched the sea. He had the stillness of someone who had stopped needing to prove things a long time ago. Tailored charcoal suit, no tie. A scar, thin and old, traced the edge of his left eyebrow. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that looked carved rather than born. When the waiter brought Imani the bill and she flinched at it, the man's eyes flicked toward her, not pitying, just noticing. She paid in cash, counting bills, cheeks warm. She left quickly. She didn't know his name was Taeyang Seo. She didn't know that the Hanwari Grand was one of his hotels, or that the conglomerate Derek had spent her $18,000 trying to impress was several shells deep, controlled by the very man drinking tea in the corner. She didn't know that Taeyang had already pulled Derek's file that morning, a habit, vetting anyone who tried to enter his orbit, and found a thin, ugly portrait of a man who collected investors the way some men collect debts. What Taeyang noticed about Imani wasn't her face, though he'd remember it later in unexpected moments. It was the way she'd squared her shoulders before walking out, the deliberate dignity of someone refusing to look as defeated as she felt. He recognized it. He'd spent his whole life around people who performed power. He almost never saw someone perform composure, the harder, lonelier thing. That evening, his assistant, a sharp woman named Ballroom, set a slim folder on his desk. "The American," she said. "Vance. His proposal's worthless. He's using a woman's money and a borrowed reputation. He's scheduled to attend the Foundation Gala Friday. Shall I have him removed from the list?" Taeyang was quiet for a long moment, looking at a printed photo paper clipped inside the folder. Imani, caught mid-laugh in some older picture, before the years with Derek had taught her to make herself smaller. "No," he said finally. "Let him come. I want to see who he brings." Moram raised an eyebrow but said nothing. In 12 years of working for Taeyang Seo, she had learned that his curiosity was the most dangerous thing in any room, and that he had not been curious about anything in a very long time. Imani spent the next 2 days discovering, piece by piece, that the life Derek had sold her was a stage set with nothing behind it. It started small. A declined card at the hotel boutique, Derek waving it off. Bank flagged it for fraud, international thing. Then the front desk politely mentioning that the room would need a new payment method by Friday. Then a phone call she wasn't supposed to overhear, Derek's voice low and slick through the bathroom door. "She doesn't know. She thinks the money went to the deal. By the time she figures it out, we'll be... No, listen. The wife angle plays better here. The Korean's like a family man." The wife angle. Imani sat down on the edge of the enormous bed and felt the floor of her life tilt. There was no deal. There had never been a deal in the way he'd described it. There was Derek, working some long con on people far more dangerous than he understood. And there was her. The prop, the proof of life, the line of credit that smiled on command. She checked her bank app with shaking hands. The studio fund was gone, of course, but there were 2 charges she didn't recognize, both to a jeweler in the hotel arcade. She walked down and asked. The clerk, after some confusion, showed her the receipt, an engagement ring and a matching band, purchased on a card linked to her account, ordered for pickup Friday. He was going to propose to her, at the gala, as a performance, to sell the family man story to investors, using a ring he'd bought with her own stolen money. She didn't cry. That surprised her later. She just stood very still in the cool, cedar-scented arcade and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that the man she loved did not exist and never had her. There was only the role she'd been cast to play, and she had been playing it for free. That night, Derek came back charming, talking about Friday like it was their wedding, slipping his arm around her waist. And here is the part Imani would be proudest of later. She smiled back. She let him think the prop was still working, because somewhere in those 2 days, beneath the heartbreak, something else had woken up, something cold and patient in hers. She thought, "You want a performance, Derek? Fine, let's give them a show." What she didn't know was that she wasn't the only one planning one. Somewhere 14 floors above her, Taeyang Seo was reading an updated report, one that now included 2 jewelry charges, an emptied savings account, and a return flight quietly canceled 3 days prior. He set the folder down and looked out at the lights of Seoul for a long time. The stakes had just changed. This was no longer about a worthless investor. A woman was about to be robbed in public, and Taeyang Seo, a man who had ordered terrible things in his life, found he could not stomach this small, ordinary cruelty. The morning of the gala, a note arrived with Imani's room service breakfast. Cream paper, no hotel logo, 3 lines in precise handwriting. The ring was bought with your money. You already know. Come to the Cedar Lounge at noon if you'd like to do something about it. T.S. She almost didn't go. Every instinct Odessa had built into her said don't trust the mysterious billionaire with the scarred eyebrow. But the alternative was to be humiliated again, on a bigger stage, and Imani was done being humiliated. He was at the same window table. He stood when she approached, a small thing, but no man had stood for her in years. "Mr. Seo," she said, "I assume since you know about the ring." "Taeyang." He gestured to the seat. "Sit, please." She sat. She did not soften. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He considered the question with a seriousness that unsettled her. 3 days ago I didn't. You were a line item in a file." He turned the teacup slowly. "Then I watched you pay a coffee bill like it cost you something, and walk out like it hadn't. I've spent 30 years learning to read people. You're the first person I've read in a long time who wasn't trying to be read. I find I don't want to watch a man like Vance burn you for theater." "That's not a reason," Imani said. "That's a feeling." The corner of his mouth moved. "Where I come from, those are often the same thing." He set down the cup. "Let me be honest about what I am, because you'll find out anyway. My family's businesses are not all clean. People call us many things. Some of them are true. I am not a good man, Imani Brooks, but I am a precise one, and I keep my word, and I do not lie to people I respect." The bluntness landed strangely. After 4 years of Derek's silk, this felt like cold water, like truth. "So, what are you offering?" she asked. "To rescue me?" "No." The word was firm. "If I rescue you, you trade one man's leash for another's. I'm offering you tools." He slid a thin folder across the table. Inside, bank records, the jewelry receipts, photos of Derek meeting 2 other investors, other women, in other hotel lobbies, other props. "He's done this 4 times that I can find. You're not his first. The 18,000 is recoverable with proof. The humiliation he planned for tonight, that you can turn around. But you do it, not me. I'll open the doors. You walk through them." Imani stared at the folder, at the faces of the other women, each of them smiling, each of them not yet knowing. Something protective and furious rose in her chest, and it wasn't only for herself. "Why does it cost me nothing?" she said. "Nothing costs nothing." "It costs you the risk," he said. "Vance is small, but the men he's lying to are not. If you expose him tonight in my ballroom, you make yourself visible. I will make sure you're safe, but I won't pretend there's no edge to this." He met her eyes. "And there's one more term. When this is over, you owe me nothing. Not gratitude, not a dinner, nothing. I won't have you trade one debt for another. Whatever happens between us after tonight, if anything, it starts at zero. Do you understand?" She did. And that, more than the folder, more than the tools, was the thing that made her trust him. He had given her the one gift Derek never had, an exit with no strings. "Okay," Imani said. Her voice didn't shake. "Show me the doors." By 4 o'clock, Imani had stopped being a victim and started being an architect. Boram came to her room with a garment bag and a tablet. The dress inside was not borrowed, and not Derek's idea of who she should be. It was deep emerald, cut clean and strong, chosen, Boram said dryly, to be remembered. But the dress wasn't the weapon. The tablet was. On it, Imani assembled the proof into something undeniable. The bank statements, the 4 faces, a recorded confession she got herself. Because here's what she did first, and it terrified her. She called Derek into the room before the gala, and she set her first boundary, the first real one in 4 years. "I want to be part of the proposal tonight," she said, playing the prop perfectly. "Tell me the plan. I don't want to mess it up in front of all those people." And Derek, drunk on his own cleverness, told her. Everything. The investors he was conning, the family man's story, how he'd canceled her return flight so she couldn't get cold feet. He laughed about the 18,000. "Best money you ever spent, baby. On us." Her phone in her clutch recorded all of it. When he left to dress, Imani sat down and shook for exactly 2 minutes. Then she stopped. The first resistance came fast. Derek's investors weren't fools, and one of them, a heavy-set man named Mr. Pak, caught her in the corridor and gripped her elbow hard. "The American says you're his fiancée," Pak said, breath sour. "I deal in certainties, woman. If he's lying to me, you both bleed for it." For one cold second, Imani understood Taeyang's warning about edges. This was real. Men like this didn't post bad reviews. They made people disappear. She held his gaze. "He's lying to you," she said quietly. "And tonight I'm going to prove it. To everyone. So you'll never have to wonder. All I ask is that you watch." Pak studied her. Then, slowly, he let go. "I'll watch," he said, and walked away. That was the moment Imani knew she'd crossed over. The old Imani would have apologized, smoothed it over, shrunk. This one had looked a dangerous man in the eye and offered him the truth like a blade. If this story is hitting somewhere real for you, if you've ever had to find your spine in a hallway you never chose to walk down, comment, "I see her," below, and share this with someone who needs the reminder that it's never too late to stop performing. The gala began at 7. Imani entered on Derek's arm in the emerald dress, and she felt 300 eyes land and reassess. Derek, oblivious, beamed. "See?" he murmured. "You clean up fine. Just don't talk too much tonight. Let me lead." He guided her toward the men he meant to fool, toward the moment he thought would crown him. He had no idea he was walking her straight to the microphone. Across the room, by a marble column, Taeyang Seo watched in a black suit, perfectly still, a man who had opened every door and would not touch a single one. The rest was hers. And then a server, by arrangement, bumped Derek's elbow. The wine, the glass, the shatter, 300 people turning. Derek's panicked, ugly improvisation. "She's not even that pretty. I did her a favor bringing her here." And from the column, a voice like a closing vault. "Then why can't I stop looking at her?" The room went so quiet you could hear the chandelier crystals tremble. Taeyang Seo did not walk to Imani. That was the genius of it. He simply turned the eyes of the room toward her and then stopped, seating the floor. Every person there understood that the most powerful man in the building had just chosen her side, and Derek finally understood the size of his mistake. Imani picked up the microphone from the small stage where the foundation's chairman had been about to speak. Her hand was steady. "My name is Imani Brooks," she said, and her voice filled the room, clear, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had stopped asking permission. "I'm a textile designer from Atlanta, Georgia. The man who just told you I'm not pretty is named Derek Vance. He's about to propose to me tonight, in front of all of you, with a ring he bought 3 days ago." She let the pause sit. "Using money he stole from me." Murmurs rippled. Derek's smile curdled. "Imani, baby, what are you?" "He told you he's an importer with overseas partners," she continued, turning toward Mr. Pak and the other investors. "He's not. He has no business. What he has is a method." The screens flanking the stage, Boram's quiet handiwork, lit up with the 4 faces. "These are 4 women. Atlanta, Houston, Lagos, Manila. Each one funded a deal. Each one was a fiancé for exactly as long as her money lasted." The bank records appeared, the jewelry receipts in Imani's name. "He canceled my return flight so I couldn't leave. And tonight he planned to propose with my own stolen money to convince you he's a family man worth investing in." "This is insane," Derek sputtered. "She's unstable. She's—" Imani pressed her phone to the microphone. Derek's own voice rolled across the ballroom, recorded crisp and clear 2 hours earlier. "Best money you ever spent, baby. On us. Canceled your flight so you couldn't get cold feet." His laugh, that cruel laugh, echoing back at him from every speaker. The silence after was the most satisfying sound Imani had ever heard. Mr. Pak rose slowly from his table. He didn't look at Imani. He looked at Derek, and his expression was the patient, terrible calm of a man recalculating a debt. "We had certainties to discuss, Mr. Vance," he said. "It seems we still do." Derek bolted for the doors. He didn't make it. Hotel security, Tae-young's people, who answered to Boram's small nod, folded him up neatly between 2 service exits. Later, there would be Interpol, fraud charges across 3 countries, the 18,000 returned to Imani's account with interest she didn't ask for. But that came later. In that moment, Imani stood alone on the stage, emerald and unbroken, 300 faces looking at her not with pity, but with something she hadn't felt directed at her in years: respect. She set the microphone down, and from across the room, Tae-young Seo inclined his head, a small, precise bow. "Well done, all you." She thought it was over. It wasn't. Not the hard part. 3 weeks later, Imani had stayed in Seoul. Not for Tae-young. She'd held him to his starts at 0, and he'd kept it, sending nothing but the occasional note, never pressing. She stayed because for the first time in years she had room to breathe, and a textile manufacturer in the Dongdaemun district had seen her old portfolio and offered her studio space to develop a collection. That was when Tasha called. And then, 3 days later, when her mother called. And then Derek's mother, Gloria, a woman who had always called Imani, the daughter I never had, when she needed something. "He's facing 20 years, Imani." Gloria's voice was wet with practiced tears. "You did this to him. You could drop the charges. You could tell them you misremembered. You always were the forgiving one, the good one. This isn't you, baby. The Imani I know doesn't destroy people. Come home. Be who you've always been." There it was, the oldest hook. Be who you've always been. The pull back into the small, sacrificing shape that everyone found so convenient. Imani sat in her new studio, bolts of fabric and colors like music stacked around her, and she felt the old guilt rise. Automatic, bone deep, the reflex of a lifetime spent measuring her worth and how much of herself she gave away. And then she let it pass through her like weather. "Gloria," she said gently, and her gentleness was real, which made it stronger. "I know you love your son, but your son stole from 4 women and was going to feed me to dangerous men to save himself. I didn't destroy him. He did that. I just stopped helping him hide it. after everything we did for you." "You never did anything for me," Imani said, and it cost her nothing because it was simply true. "I did things for you, for all of you, for years, and I called it love because no one ever taught me the difference." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "The Imani you knew is the one who let herself be emptied so everyone else could stay full. She's gone, Gloria. I'm not going back for her. She wasn't real. She was just tired." She hung up. Her hands were steady. She turned back to her fabric, a deep emerald shot through with gold, a color she'd dreamed years ago and never had time to make. This time, she had time. She had nothing but time, and it was finally, gloriously, her own. 8 months later, the Dongdaemun collection launched. Imani named it Odessa, after her grandmother. 12 pieces built around textiles she'd designed entirely herself, patterns that moved like sound across silk and structured cotton. She'd funded it with the returned $18,000 and a small business loan she qualified for on her own name, her own credit, rebuilt from the wreckage Derek left. She took no money from Taeyang. He offered once, early, a flat, generous, no-strings investment, and she turned it down. And the strange thing was, she could see he was glad she had. "Good," was all he said. "It means more when it's yours." The launch was in a converted warehouse in Seoul, racks of emerald and rust and indigo catching the light. Buyers came from 3 countries. A Milanese boutique placed an order that made Ballroom, who'd quietly become Imani's friend, actually gasp. A Korean fashion magazine ran a profile. The American designer Seoul didn't see coming. They used a photograph of Imani in her studio, no makeup, hands stained faintly with dye, laughing, the realest she'd looked since she was 20. That night, alone after the crowds left, Imani stood in the empty warehouse among her own creations and felt something she had chased her entire life without knowing its name. It wasn't being chosen. It wasn't being rescued. It wasn't even being loved. It was being enough, wholly, quietly, on her own terms, by her own hand. She had built a thing of beauty out of nothing but her talent and her stubbornness, and the $18,000 a man had stolen and the universe had returned. No one had given this to her. She had taken it, made it, earned it. She thought of Odessa's knees giving out on those office building floors, of all the love her grandmother had poured out and rarely gotten back. "This one's for you," Imani thought, running her hand along a bolt of emerald silk. And this time, somebody kept some for herself. She drove home through the bright Seoul night, and for the first time in years, she wasn't running toward anyone or away from anything. She was just going home. To her own apartment, her own life, her own self, fully restored, no longer for rent. Taeyang Seo had kept his distance for nearly a year, and it had nearly killed him, which he found mildly humiliating. They'd seen each other, of course. Dinners that he was always careful to frame as friendship. He never pushed. He'd meant what he said about Zero. But the night after the Odessa launch, he came to her studio with a bottle of soju and 2 cups, and for once he looked less like a man who owned the room and more like one hoping to be let in. "You did it without me," he said. "Completely. I want you to know I noticed." "I know you noticed." Imani poured the soju. "You notice everything. It's your most attractive and most exhausting quality." He laughed, a real one, rare, scarred eyebrow lifting. Then he was quiet. "I've never said this to anyone," he admitted. "I spent my whole life around people who needed me, or feared me, or wanted what I could give them. I never knew what it would be like to want someone who needed nothing from me at all." He turned the cup in his fingers, that old habit. "You terrify me, Imani Brooks. You're the first person I can't do anything for. I can only stand next to." She understood the size of that confession. This was a man who controlled everything through what he could provide. To love someone he couldn't buy, protect, or rescue, to want only to stand beside, was, for him, the deepest possible surrender. "Then stand next to me," she said softly. "Not above, not in front, beside." She reached across the table and took his hand, the first time she had touched him in all these months. I don't need you to save me, Taeyang. I already did that. But I think I'd like to know you, as an equal. Two people who built themselves out of hard things, choosing each other on purpose, owing each other nothing. He looked at their hands. This man who had ordered terrible things, who had never bowed to anyone, lowered his head, and for the first time in his life, it wasn't strategy. It was relief. "Start at 0, he murmured. "Start at 0, she agreed, "and see what we make." It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no rescue, no white horse, no king lifting a poor girl out of the dirt. It was something rarer. Two whole people, neither needing the other to be whole, deciding the standing beside was worth more than any throne. So what is the difference between being loved and being used? Imani Brooks learned it in a wine-soaked ballroom 12,000 kilometers from home. Being used asks you to become smaller, so someone else can become larger. Being loved asks you to become more, and stands beside you while you do. She came to Seoul as a prop in someone else's story, and stayed as the author of her own. She got her money back, yes. She got justice, and a thriving collection bearing her grandmother's name, and eventually, on her own terms, a love that started at 0 and grew into something built rather than borrowed. But none of those were the real victory. The real victory was the woman in the empty warehouse, hands stained with dye, finally understanding she had always been enough, that the love she'd been pouring out for years had been there all along. She'd just been spending it on everyone but herself. If this story moved you, do 3 things for me. Comment below and tell me about the moment you stopped shrinking. Share this with someone who's still pouring themselves out for people who only see them as a line of credit. And subscribe, because every week I tell the stories of people who finally chose themselves. Because here's the truth, and I want you to carry it with you. She didn't get a fairy tale ending. She got something better. She got herself back.